Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan for more Southwest Outlaw stories. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for future videos. Relax and enjoy. Welcome to Southwest Desert, where we explore the most fascinating stories from the American Southwest. Today, we're diving into the remarkable tale of the Christian Brothers, a pair of outlaws who carved their own violent path through Oklahoma Territory and the American Southwest in the late 1800s. Picture, if you will, the untamed landscape of Oklahoma Territory, just north of the Canadian River, in what would later become Pottawatomie County. This wasn't just any frontier region. This was a place where lawlessness thrived in what locals called saloon towns. Young's Crossing, Keokuk Falls, Violet Springs, and the settlement known simply as the Corner. The level of violence in these parts was staggering, even by frontier standards. Keokuk Falls alone housed what locals called the Seven Deadly Saloons, and the brutality was exemplified by the murder of saloon-keeper Haining. Not content with shooting him in the head, his killer returned to drive a rusty nail into the dead man's ear, a grotesque signature that spoke to the savage nature of the territory. Shawnee, another notorious town, had earned a particular reputation for violence during train stops. The scale of vice in the region was almost incomprehensible. By 1903, Shawnee's daily consumption included 25 gallons of whiskey and 700 gallons of beer. The broader region boasted over 60 saloons and 2 distilleries, creating a perfect haven for some of the West's most infamous outlaws. The Daltons, Bill Doolin, Zip Wyatt, and the Casey Boys all found refuge in these parts. This was the birthplace of the term bootlegger, describing smugglers who concealed bottles in their boot tops. When Oklahoma finally went dry in 1907, these bootleggers would find plenty of willing customers for their illicit trade. The Christian Brothers' story is particularly compelling because they weren't born into the criminal life. The Christian family was initially well respected in the territory, making the brothers' descent into lawlessness all the more dramatic. By their 20s, they had already established themselves as whiskey runners and horse thieves, operating out of Andy Morrison's saloon in Violet Springs. Morrison's association with the brothers would prove fatal. He was later murdered in his own saloon's back room. The brothers' first major crime occurred in 1895, marking their decisive turn toward serious outlawry. After leaving Doug Barnes's saloon with their associate John Mackey, they encountered Deputy Will Turner, who held warrants for their arrest. In the ensuing confrontation, all 3 men drew their weapons against Turner, resulting in the deputy's death in the street. While Sheriff Billy Trousdale managed to capture Mackey, and the Christian brothers eventually surrendered, their time in custody would be short-lived. The brothers received substantial sentences, though accounts differ on the exact terms. The court reporter remembered sentences of 25 and 22 years, while the Oklahoma City Oklahoman reported more lenient terms of 8 and 10 years. Regardless of the actual sentences, the brothers had no intention of serving their time. On June 30, 1895, they orchestrated one of the most daring prison breaks in Oklahoma Territory history. The Oklahoma County Jail was a 2-story building with interior steel cages, where the brothers shared a cell with one of the Casey brothers, who was imprisoned for the murder of Deputy Marshal Sam Ferris. Their accomplice, Jesse Finley, smuggled guns into the jail, which the outlaws cleverly concealed in their cell's stovepipe. Despite receiving warnings about a potential break, jailer Garver failed to take adequate precautions. The escape occurred on a Sunday during corridor time. The brothers overpowered Garver, pistol-whipping him before fleeing through an alley. One brother commandeered Police Chief Jones's horse, while the other fled on foot with Casey. Their escape route was marked by violence from the start. When they attempted to steal a buggy, they encountered Gus White, shooting him in the leg and stomach, though White survived. The violence escalated when they encountered Police Chief Jones himself, who was shot at close range. While a coroner's jury would later blame Casey for the chief's death, the incident sparked a massive manhunt. The fugitives soon found themselves in a fierce shootout on Grand Avenue with officers Stafford and Jackson. Casey was killed in the exchange, and Bob Christian was wounded but managed to escape after stealing blacksmith Frank Berg's cart, later upgrading to a faster team. The aftermath of the escape brought swift justice to some of the conspirators. Jesse Finley received 14 months in jail for smuggling the weapons, while jailer Garver was sentenced to 10 years, though he would serve only 2 before receiving a pardon. Free once again, the Christian Brothers embarked on an ambitious crime spree, targeting 20 to 30 post offices and general stores throughout the territory. Their gang suffered casualties along the way. Deputy Marshal Stockton killed Fessenden, Foster Holbrook was captured, and John Reeves was arrested near Powley. The brothers themselves remained active, engaging in several notable confrontations with law enforcement, including an August 23rd shootout west of Purcell, the robbery of an Edmond Railroad agent in early September, the October 6 St. Louis and San Francisco train robbery, and a December heist at the Colgate Mining Company store. As the heat intensified in Oklahoma, the brothers made a strategic decision to head southwest. They first settled in Seven Rivers, New Mexico, before making their way to Arizona's Sulphur Springs Valley. There, they crafted new identities. Bill became Ed Williams, earning the nickname Black Jack, while Bob took the name Tom Anderson. Bill, now known as 202 due to his weight, found work at the 4-Bar Ranch breaking horses. He partnered with Ed Wilson, and while known as a reliable partner, developed a reputation for wild spending. However, the brothers hadn't abandoned their criminal ways. They became key members of the notorious High Fives gang. This crew represented a who's who of southwestern outlawry. Besides the Christian Brothers, it included Cole Young, an alias for Harris, Bob Hayes, possibly Sam Hassels, George Musgrave, who used aliases including Jeff Davis and Jesse Johnson, Jesse Williams, and Three-Fingered Jack Dunlap. The gang was renowned for their exceptional marksmanship, and they modified their guns by removing the triggers, employing a specialized fanning technique instead. The High Fives gang's most ambitious operation was the August 6, 1896 attempted robbery of the Nogales Bank. Black Jack, Musgrave, and Dunlap maintained positions outside while 3 others entered the bank, targeting a substantial sum between $10,000 and $30,000 in cash. Inside, they held cashier Frank Herrera at gunpoint, but when bank president John Dessart attempted to escape, an unexpected gust of wind created a momentary distraction. Herrera seized this opportunity to retrieve a hidden gun, and the situation quickly deteriorated as multiple citizens opened fire on the gang. This led to a dramatic pursuit involving B.E. Hambleton, Frank King, Sheriff John Roberts, and Mexican Customs gendarmes. The chase culminated in the famous Skeleton Canyon fight, where multiple posses, including those led by Sheriff Bob Leatherwood, Bert Alvord, and Sheriff Camillus Fly, caught up with the gang. The ensuing battle proved deadly. Deputy Frank Robinson was killed, multiple horses were shot, and Hildreth was wounded, though the gang ultimately managed to escape. The Christian Brothers and their associates continued their criminal activities, executing robberies at the San Simon Railroad Station and the Bowie Post Office and store. During an attempted train robbery at Rio Puerco, the gang suffered a significant loss when Cole Young was killed by Marshal Loomis. However, the most notable casualty came on April 27, 1897, when Black Jack met his end near Clifton. Competing accounts exist regarding his death. Some attribute it to an encounter with Fred Higgins's posse, while others credit Deputy Sheriff Ben Clark's party with the fatal shots. The fates of the other gang members varied significantly. Bob Christian made a brief appearance in Mexico in autumn 1897 but managed to escape arrest and vanished completely from historical record. George Musgrave's story continued for decades. He was arrested in North Platte, Nebraska in 1909, later relocating to South America where he lived until his death in Paraguay in 1947. Three-Fingered Jack Dunlap met a violent end at the hands of Jeff Milton. An intriguing postscript to the Christian Brothers saga came in 1901 when Black Jack Ketchum stood on the gallows. He claimed that Christian was still alive and took the secret of Christian's whereabouts to his grave. Like many aspects of the Christian Brothers story, the truth of this claim remains one of the many mysteries of the American frontier. The Christian Brothers tale provides a perfect lens through which to view the changing American West of the 1890s. Starting in the lawless saloon towns of Oklahoma Territory, where violence and vice were daily companions, they carved a path of increasing violence and sophistication in their crimes. Their journey from local troublemakers to leaders of one of the Southwest's most notorious gangs mirrors the evolution of frontier outlawry itself, as criminals adapted to the closing of the American frontier and the increasing reach of law enforcement. The story of the Christian Brothers reminds us that the Wild West earned its name not through dime novels and tall tales, but through the very real and often violent lives of men who chose to live outside the law. Until next time, this is Southwest Desert, bringing you the true stories of the American Southwest. Welcome to Southwest Desert, the channel that explores the shadowy corners of American Southwest frontier history. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most notorious trading routes of the Old West, the Santa Fe Trail, a vital commercial lifeline that shaped the American Southwest for 6 turbulent decades. Before we meet our cast of outlaws, let's trace the path they haunted. Starting from the bustling Missouri border towns, the trail stretched across the vast Kansas prairies, challenging travelers with its endless horizon. It then wound through southeastern Colorado, where the real dangers began. The route's most treacherous section came at Raton Pass, a natural bottleneck where bandits could easily trap their prey. Finally, after weeks of dusty travel, merchants would reach their destination, the ancient plaza of Santa Fe, where fortunes could be made or lost. From 1821 to 1881, this commercial artery pumped the lifeblood of trade between the American territories and the Southwest. But where there's commerce, there are always those waiting to profit by force rather than honest labor. Our first tale of treachery takes us to 1864, when Don Antonio Manuel Otero, one of New Mexico's most prominent merchants, dispatched what he thought was a well-protected caravan. His trusted mayordomo led the wagon train, loaded with a fortune in purchasing money bound for Kansas City. As they approached the summit of Raton Pass, where the thin mountain air made every step treacherous, they encountered a group of armed men. "We're Texans," the strangers claimed, but this was just another deception in a land built on them. Local investigators would later theorize these were actually local criminals, using the chaos of the Civil War as cover for their crimes. These frontier predators didn't just steal the money. They took every saddle and draft animal, effectively stranding the caravan in one of the most inhospitable stretches of the trail. When word reached General Henry Carleton, he immediately dispatched soldiers to hunt down the perpetrators. But in the vastness of the territory, finding a few well-prepared bandits was like searching for a particular grain of sand in the desert. This robbery would go down in history as the first documented heist of its kind between New Mexico and the states, setting a bloody precedent for the decades to follow. But if Don Otero's robbery represented the beginning of organized crime on the trail, the Barlow and Sanderson stagecoach robbery would elevate it to an art form of violence. Led by the infamous Kid Barton, This heist would claim 3 lives: an express messenger and 2 passengers who made the fatal mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The take? A staggering $60,000, enough to set up a man for life if he lived long enough to spend it. The response to this bloodshed was swift and determined. A massive posse formed, eventually tracking Barton and his gang to the area that would later become Tucumcari. What followed was the stuff of dime novel legend. In a gun battle that would be talked about for years, Kid Barton proved why he was one of the most feared men in the territory, gunning down not only the sheriff but 2 of his deputies as well. But even Kid Barton's legendary marksmanship couldn't save him from frontier justice. Captured alive, he soon found himself dancing at the end of a rope, his body left hanging from a bridge as a warning to others who might follow in his footsteps. Yet somehow, this dramatic tale has largely faded from outlaw history, overshadowed by more famous names like Jesse James and Billy the Kid. But perhaps the most chilling chapter in the Santa Fe Trail's criminal history belongs to the peculiar partnership of Coal Oil Johnny and Tom Taylor, who terrorized the trail around 1872. These men were psychological terrorists as much as bandits, pioneering a method of robbery that played on the frontier tradition of hospitality. They would appear as friendly travelers, riding alongside stages and wagon trains, engaging in pleasant conversation with even the most experienced drivers. Uncle Billy Hubble, Charlie Evans, Jim Aney, and Jim Abercrombie, all veteran stage drivers who knew every rock and raven on the trail, fell for their act. The outlaws would pass the time with stories and jokes, lulling their victims into a false sense of security. Then, without warning, they would transform from companionable travelers into cold-blooded killers. What set Coal Oil Johnny and Taylor apart wasn't just their method. It was their brutality. They didn't merely rob and ride away. They left their victims dead on the prairie, as one witness put it, to feed the coyotes. This callous disregard for human life made them particularly feared among travelers and stage companies alike. The Barlow and Sanderson Company, hemorrhaging money from lost strongboxes, finally offered a substantial reward for their capture. The English-owned Maxwell Land Grant Company, tired of seeing their interests threatened, added to the bounty, putting up $2,000 for each outlaw, a king's ransom in those days. Such wealth attracted serious manhunters. From Texas came Jim McIntyre and Frank Stewart, bounty hunters who would add their own tragic chapter to this tale. These experienced manhunters tracked their quarry to an unlikely location, Collier's Soap Factory, 7 miles from Fort Union at the foot of the Turkey Mountains. Concealed among the lava rocks, McIntyre and Stewart waited patiently. They knew Coal Oil Johnny and Taylor were planning another stage robbery, and this spot offered the perfect ambush location. When the outlaws appeared, the bounty hunters struck with lethal efficiency. The bodies were transported to Cimarron, where they were photographed laid out on a hotel door at Lambert's, a macabre trophy display typical of the era. Those who saw the photographs remarked on the physical contrast between the partners. Taylor was extraordinarily tall, while Coal Oil Johnny was notably short. Even in death, Coal Oil Johnny maintained his mystery. His real name remained unknown, though rumors persisted that he came from a respectable family and had been given a proper name at birth. But the story doesn't end there. In a twist worthy of Greek tragedy, the very men who brought these outlaws to justice would themselves succumb to the siren song of easy money. After collecting their $4,000 reward, both McIntyre and Stewart remained in the territory, only to turn to a life of crime themselves. McIntyre's tale would end violently in Texas, where he met his match in the legendary gunfighter Luke Short. Stewart's fate proved more enigmatic. He simply vanished into the frontier, becoming another ghost story in a land already full of them. Today, visitors to Cimarron can still touch this violent history. Still stands the old Lambert's Hotel, now known as the St. James. Walk into what was once the saloon, look up at the ceiling, and you'll see the original bullet holes, silent witnesses to an era when business disputes were settled with gunpowder rather than lawsuits. The Santa Fe Trail's significance as a commercial route ended around 1881, made obsolete by the iron horse of progress, the railroad. But its legacy of bloodshed and banditry lives on in these tales of greed, violence, and frontier justice. From Don Otero's stolen caravan to the bullet-riddled ceiling of the St. James Hotel, the ghosts of these outlaws still ride the wind across the New Mexico territory. They remind us of a time when commerce and death traveled the same dusty road to Santa Fe, when fortune seekers had to weigh the potential profits against the very real possibility that they might end up as another sun-bleached skeleton on the prairie, their bones picked clean by the very coyotes that once howled at night outside their camps. This has been Southwest Desert. Join us next time as we explore another forgotten chapter of America's Southwest frontier past. Welcome to the Southwest Desert, where we explore the fascinating characters who shaped the American Southwest frontier. Today, we're diving into the remarkable life of Clay Allison, a man whose legacy, while less celebrated than his contemporaries like Billy the Kid, tells an equally compelling story of justice, violence, and redemption in the Old West. The story of Clay Allison begins, as many frontier tales do, with humble origins. Born under what locals called an unlucky alignment of stars in Tennessee in 1840, Allison's life seemed marked by fate from his very first breath. As a young child, he suffered a devastating head injury that would leave him with a permanent mental disorder, a condition that would cast a long shadow over his future actions and decisions. This early trauma would prove to be just the first of many physical and mental challenges that would shape his extraordinary life. Unlike many of his gunslinging contemporaries who achieved immortality through early, violent deaths, Allison's story took a different path. He shared a fascinating parallel with Billy the Kid in that both men were deeply polarizing figures in their time, passionately loved by some and intensely hated by many more. However, where Billy the Kid's legend was cemented by his dramatic death at a young age, Allison's legacy would be shaped by a life that stretched well beyond his violent years, ultimately affecting how history would remember him. When the drums of war began beating in 1861, Allison, like countless other young Southern men, answered the Confederate call to arms. However, his military career proved remarkably brief and would foreshadow the instability that would characterize much of his later life. Within months of joining, he was discharged due to emotional instability, a decision that would set him adrift into the vast expanse of Texas, where the next chapter of his life would unfold. In the Lone Star State, Allison initially found purpose as a cowhand, working for none other than Charles Goodnight, one of the most respected cattlemen of the era. It was during this period that he began building the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his days. However, it was the legendary Johnson Waterhole incident that would first truly establish his name in frontier lore. This extraordinary confrontation perfectly encapsulates the peculiar mix of violence and civility that characterized the Old West. When a dispute arose over access to a waterhole, Allison and his opponent agreed to settle their differences in a fight to the death. What makes this story particularly remarkable is what happened next. The two men, with only one shovel between them, took turns politely digging what would become one of their graves. The ensuing combat was described by witnesses as furious and bloody, with both men wielding Bowie knives in the freshly dug pit. Allison emerged victorious but paid a heavy price. He suffered a serious thigh injury that would leave him with a permanent limp and force him to adapt his riding style with one short stirrup. This physical reminder of the fight would stay with him for the rest of his life, giving him a distinctive appearance that became part of his legend. This wouldn't be his only notable injury. A later accident where he shot himself in the foot was captured in a surviving photograph, showing him seated with a bandaged foot and crutches beside him, a rare glimpse into the vulnerable moments of a man known for his toughness. By 1870, Allison had made his way to Cimarron, Colfax County, New Mexico, where he established a ranching operation. It was here that his legend would truly begin to take shape. His first major gunfight occurred at the Clifton House, a well-known stage stop on the Santa Fe Trail, where he killed an outlaw named Chuck Colburn. This encounter would set the pattern for many of his future confrontations: violent, decisive, and, in Allison's view, justified. But it was his role in the Colfax County War of 1875 that would truly define his character and cement his place in Western history. This complex conflict centered on the Maxwell land grant disputes and the corrupt Santa Fe Ring, a powerful group of politicians and businessmen who controlled much of New Mexico's political and economic life. Despite being a rancher himself, Allison sided with the homesteaders, driven by what appears to have been a genuine sense of fair play and justice. This decision would put him at odds with some of the most powerful men in the territory. The conflict reached a boiling point with the murder of Reverend E.J. Tolby, who had courageously exposed the ring's corruption in national news. When Tolby was found dead, presumably assassinated on the ring's orders, Allison took matters into his own hands. He led a lynch mob that tracked down the alleged murderer and hanged him on a telegraph pole. One of the most dramatic episodes from this period occurred in a local saloon, where Allison confronted Pancho Griego, a known member of the Santa Fe Ring. The encounter ended with Griego's death, adding another chapter to Allison's growing reputation as a man not to be crossed. But perhaps most revealing of his complex character was the newspaper incident, which showcased both his volatile nature and his peculiar sense of honor. In a drunken rage, Allison destroyed a press and blew up a newspaper office, going so far as to throw the press into the river. However, the next morning, upon finding Mrs. Ada Morley, who was pregnant at the time, crying at her destroyed office, Allison's response revealed the complexities of his character. After delivering what witnesses described as a severe verbal reprimand, he declared firmly, "I don't fight women," and handed over money to replace the press. His violent encounters continued to accumulate throughout his life. In Colorado, he killed a deputy sheriff but managed to avoid a murder conviction, demonstrating either his luck or his skill at navigating the legal system of the time. In Dodge City, he engaged in a shooting spree that forced even the legendary Bat Masterson and his fellow officers to seek cover. Yet despite these outbursts of violence, Allison maintained what he considered a personal code of honor. He was known to never initiate fights, though he never avoided them either. This principle seemed to guide his actions throughout his life, even if his interpretation of what constituted a justified fight might have differed from others. Later in life, Allison surprised many by settling down, marrying what contemporary accounts described as a respectable woman, and returning to ranching in Texas. However, his eccentric behavior continued to manifest in various ways. In one particularly memorable incident, he rode horseback through town completely naked, shocking the local populace. In another instance, after a dentist pulled the wrong tooth, Allison forced the unfortunate practitioner into the chair and pulled one of his teeth in retaliation. The end of Clay Allison's story carries a certain irony that wouldn't have been lost on the man himself. This notorious gunfighter, who had survived countless violent encounters and seemed to court death at every turn, met his end in a mundane wagon accident. While returning from drinking, his wagon hit a chuck hole, throwing him from his seat. The rear wheel ran over his neck, killing him instantly. He was buried beside the Pecos River, and his tombstone bore what many considered a handsome tribute on the frontier. He never killed a man who didn't need killing. Clay Allison's legacy presents a complex portrait of frontier justice. He was a man of stark contradictions, capable of extreme violence yet guided by a strong personal code, unpredictable in his actions but unwavering in his sense of justice. His story differs from many Wild West tales precisely because he lived long enough to see the frontier begin to fade, dying not in a gunfight but in an ordinary accident. Perhaps it's this very ordinary death that has caused his story to be less celebrated than those of his contemporaries. Yet, in many ways, Allison's life better represents the true complexity of the American frontier. He wasn't simply a hero or a villain, but a man shaped by his time and place, operating within his own understanding of right and wrong in a world where the line between justice and lawlessness was often remarkably thin. In the end, Clay Allison's story reminds us that the Wild West wasn't simply a place of black and white morality, but a complex landscape where justice often came at the end of a gun, and where even the most violent men could operate by their own strict code of honor. His legacy lives on not in the romantic myths of the Old West, but in the more nuanced reality of a frontier society struggling to define itself between civilization and savagery. From his tumultuous birth in Tennessee to his final resting place beside the Pecos River, Clay Allison's life story encompasses all the contradictions and complexities of the American frontier. He was a man who lived by the gun but died by accident, who destroyed property in anger but made restitution in shame, who killed men he deemed deserving but maintained his own rigid moral code. In many ways, he represents the true face of the Old West, not the simplified version of dime novels and early films, but the complex, often contradictory reality of a world in transition. I hope you enjoyed this Southwest adventure. Welcome to Southwest Desert. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating yet forgotten tales of the New Mexico Territory, the story of Vicente Silva, a man whose reign of terror would make even the most hardened outlaws of the Old West seem tame by comparison. Born in 1845 near Albuquerque, Silva came from a respectable family, and nothing in his early years hinted at the violence that would later define him. Those who knew him as a young man paint a picture that stands in stark contrast to his later reputation. He possessed a pleasing personality and sociable nature, carrying himself with a manner that inspired respect among his peers. There was no indication of what one contemporary would later call the poison in his soul. This ability to maintain a respectable facade while harboring darker intentions would become his trademark, leading many to later describe him as a wolf in sheep's clothing. By 1875, Silva had set his sights on the bustling frontier town of Las Vegas, New Mexico Territory. This was a booming mercantile hub serving as the principal supply point for ranches across a vast territory. The town's influence stretched across eastern New Mexico and extended all the way to the Texas Panhandle, making it the perfect location for an ambitious man to build his empire. It was here that Silva established the Imperial Saloon, strategically located just 1 block from the Old Town Plaza. Under his careful management, the Imperial would become the largest saloon in the territory. But Silva wasn't content with just serving drinks. He expanded the business to include a dance hall and gambling room, creating a complete entertainment complex that drew visitors from across the territory. The Imperial served as more than just a business. It became the center of Silva's carefully constructed public persona. He presented himself as a successful businessman and family man. His wife, Telesfora, contributed to this image of respectability by running a lunch counter in the saloon. His brother-in-law, Gabriel Sandoval, described by many as a timid soul, worked as the Imperial's bartender. The family's charitable side was demonstrated when they adopted a little girl named Emma, whom they had found abandoned in a livery stable manger. She became, as witnesses recalled, the household pet, adding a touch of humanity to Silva's public image. But behind the respectable facade of the Imperial Saloon, in its shadowy back rooms, Silva was methodically building something far more sinister. By the late 1880s, he had assembled one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises the territory had ever seen. His organization was a masterclass in criminal infrastructure, with a network that extended from Las Vegas to the Texas line. His attention to detail was remarkable. He required loyalty oaths from all members and maintained strict operational security that allowed the gang to successfully cover their tracks for years. Perhaps most impressive and concerning was Silva's infiltration of law enforcement. He managed to place 3 of his gang members on the Las Vegas Municipal Police Force, ensuring that any investigations into his activities would be promptly derailed. This level of corruption and organization was unprecedented in the territory. The gang's primary operation was cattle rustling, but Silva approached it with the mind of a business executive. Using the Monte Largo Ranch between Albuquerque and Santa Fe as their base of operations, his men developed sophisticated methods for processing their stolen goods. They would alter brands to make the cattle unrecognizable, slaughter them efficiently, and then sell the meat to the San Pedro mining camp, where few questions were asked about the meat's origin. But cattle rustling was just the foundation of Silva's criminal empire. The gang's activities soon expanded to include robbery and murder, with victims carefully chosen and dispatches executed with clinical precision. Among their victims were Jacob Stuzman and Abraham Abulofia, both storekeepers who had the misfortune of crossing Silva's path, and Carpio Salas, a school board treasurer whose murder demonstrated that no one was beyond Silva's reach. Despite numerous investigations by both territorial officials and San Miguel County authorities, each probe ran into convenient dead ends. Few dared to oppose Silva's growing power, and those who did often disappeared without a trace. The gang's influence had become so pervasive that even legitimate businessmen and officials learned to look the other way. But even the most carefully constructed criminal empires have their weak links. Silva's began to unravel with what seemed like a routine cattle theft from Jose Esquibel's ranch, located 50 miles south of Las Vegas. One of his men, Patricio Maes, made the fatal mistake of revealing information about the theft. When Esquibel personally recovered his cattle and filed a warrant in district court, Silva was forced to adapt quickly. Rather than face the charges, Silva fled, leaving his nephew in charge of the Imperial Saloon while he established a hideout near Mora. But even in exile, Silva maintained his iron grip on his criminal empire. He would make night visits to Las Vegas, directing his gang from his old office in the Imperial Saloon, proving that even legal pressure couldn't completely disrupt his operations. What happened next would cement Silva's reputation for brutality and demonstrate the theatrical flair he brought to his acts of violence. During a raging blizzard, he assembled a mock court in his saloon to try Patricio Maes for his betrayal. The setting was carefully chosen for maximum dramatic effect, the howling wind outside providing a haunting backdrop to the proceedings within. The jury was composed entirely of outlaws, but Silva wasn't taking any chances. Even though Maes pleaded innocent and repeatedly pledged his loyalty to the gang, Silva had already decided his fate. When the jury initially appeared divided, Silva brought out a keg of whiskey. Within 30 minutes, the drunken jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. What followed was a grotesque parody of justice. They carried Maes through the snow-choked streets to an iron bridge over the Galinas River. In a final act of mock mercy, they allowed him one last prayer before hanging him with a noose from the bridge girder. The next morning, his frozen body was discovered, serving as a stark warning to anyone who might consider crossing Vicente Silva. But it was Silva's growing paranoia that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The man who had built an empire on violence and fear began to see enemies everywhere, even within his own family. Convinced that his own flesh and blood was plotting against him, he turned his murderous attention to his brother-in-law, Gabriel Sandoval. The murder of Gabriel demonstrated Silva's capacity for intimate betrayal. He lured his brother-in-law to a deserted cemetery, a location chosen for both its privacy and symbolic significance. There, he stabbed Gabriel in the heart and disposed of his body in a garbage dump, treating his own family member with the same callous disregard he showed his other victims. But Silva's descent into paranoid violence wouldn't stop there. His final act of betrayal would be against his loyal wife Telesfora, who had stood by him through everything. Despite knowing of his criminal activities, she had maintained her own honest nature and was well liked by the gang members. Silva sent her a note requesting a secret meeting, asking her to leave Las Vegas unseen. When she arrived at his mountain camp, expecting perhaps to reconcile or plan their future, he accused her of treachery and stabbed her to death. This would prove to be Silva's fatal mistake. Telesfora had been a favorite among the gang members, and her murder turned them decisively against their leader. On May 18, 1893, they orchestrated their revenge with the same methodical precision Silva had taught them. Under the pretense of moving Telesfora's body, they wrapped her remains in a blanket and carried her to a nearby arroyo. As Silva jumped on an overhanging bank to better cover the body, the earth collapsed, seemingly nature itself conspiring in his downfall. It was then, as he walked back to camp, that Antonio Valdez approached from behind and shot him in the head, ending the reign of New Mexico's most notorious crime lord. The aftermath of Silva's death saw his criminal empire crumble with shocking speed. The fate of his gang members varied. Some were hung by vigilantes from telephone poles, others faced legal execution, and some managed to secure prison sentences in exchange for their testimony. The organization that had seemed so invincible just months before scattered to the winds, with the last member of Silva's gang surviving until 1940, carrying the dark secrets of their organization to the grave. But perhaps the most tragic epilogue to this tale belongs to Emma, the abandoned child the Silvas had adopted. After her adoptive parents' violent ends, she was raised by friends and married at 19, seemingly escaping the dark shadow of her connection to Silva. But as many would later say, fate turned against all who had any connection with Vicente Silva. In a cruel twist of destiny, Emma's clothes caught fire near a fireplace. She survived for 11 agonizing days before succumbing to her burns, becoming the final victim of what some would call the Silva curse. Vicente Silva's story serves as a dark reminder of the thin line between respectability and ruthlessness in the American frontier. While other outlaws of his era might be remembered for their noble causes or revolutionary spirit, Silva stands apart as a study in pure malevolence, a man who built an empire on violence and betrayal, only to be destroyed by the very forces he had unleashed. His legacy in Las Vegas, New Mexico, is a complex one. The Imperial Saloon, once the crown jewel of his legitimate business interests, became a symbol of how power and respectability could mask the darkest of intentions. The story of Vicente Silva reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous outlaws aren't the ones who operate outside society's bounds, but those who learn to manipulate those bounds to their advantage. This has been Southwest Desert. Join us next time as we uncover another forgotten tale from the American Southwest frontier. I hope you enjoyed these lost Southwest tales. If you would like to help my channel in time, hit the super thanks heart icon on the bottom of the video and contribute. This is very helpful. Please check out my large catalog of Southwest videos, playlists, and adult bedtime stories. Happy trails!